call, do something, I don't know.
Get off your stuff.
Eat a hot dog.
I don't even know. Oh,
Where can we find the Facebook link so we can share it?
So it's on the Asheville Museum of Science Facebook page, and we stream live from there.
Awesome. I will share it.
Thank you. And here, I can actually send it in the group chat right now.
Yeah.
So that's our Facebook page. So I have to mute me on Facebook real quick. Hello. I think I'm on.
Myself too now.
Oh yeah, we're on. Okay, thank you. And here, I can actually send it in the group chat right now. There we go. That's me. That was nice. Okay, cool. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Ask a Scientist. Today I have with us Dr. Meghan Stark. Meghan works for the National Academy of Sciences, which is a really cool nonprofit that helps Congress make some important scientific decisions and based on the data and influence their policy a little bit. So Meghan's going to start out today by talking about some of her PhD work that she did with bats. And so I am very excited, and you guys can go ahead and send questions into the chat box, and I'll make sure Meghan gets them and is able to answer them for you. So you can go ahead and take it away, Meghan.
All right, excellent. So can you hear me, Abigail?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. Hi, so everyone who's watching, thank you for joining. I'm going to start by talking about bats, why they're important, or the threats that exist of North American bats currently, and then discuss at the tail end some of my PhD research. So I wasn't sure who was going to be on the call today or who was going to be watching. So some of what I'm going over is sort of basic bat biology. So if you know it already, I apologize, but hang in there because we get to the more complicated stuff at the end, if that's what you're here to see. So I'm going to start. Oh, wait, I have to share my screen. Okay, Abigail, can you see my screen? Oh, she's muted herself. Okay, thumbs up, she can see it. Okay, perfect. All right, so the title of my talk is Saving Stellaluna, Why Bats Are Important and How We Can Help Save Them. I don't know how many of you have read this book, but I grew up reading Stellaluna. She was one of my favorite fictional characters. Stellaluna is a story about a sweet little cartoon fictional baby bat who gets separated from her mom and then learns throughout finding other animals that she has a lot in common with other types of animals, which is quite poignant for the type of talk I'm doing today. But if you haven't read Stellaluna, and I have any kids that are on here, I'm going to send Abigail a link to a virtual reading of Stellaluna. So if you haven't read it already, you should check it out. So Stellaluna is, like I said, she's a cartoon bat, but if she were real, she'd look a little like this, adorable, shameless plug, because bats are so cute and they get a bad rap. So anyway, just a tiny little baby burrito to kick us off. Have you seen a bat in real life before? Obviously, I can't see you, but nod your head or something in a virtual camaraderie as to whether or not you've seen one. I actually hadn't seen a bat other than ones flying in the sky. Like I hadn't been up close to one before I started my PhD work. So I was just curious because I know that people see them in the sky, but it's not really common to see them up close. They're a lot smaller than people think. Bats are incredibly special. They are a very unique animal group, and I was going to start by going over some of the things that make them so unique. Some of this you might already know, some of it might be a little basic, but just to sort of ground us in what we're going to be talking about. So for starters, bats are the only mammals that fly. And so I don't know if I have anyone on the call today that maybe has never heard of a definition of what a mammal is, but a mammal is a group of animals that have the following characteristics. So they give birth to live young, which means that the animal has already hatched out of their egg when it's born. They have hair or fur. And then the mammal mothers nurse their young with milk, and they're warm-blooded as opposed to cold-blooded. And so bats have all of these characteristics. And then on top of that, they fly. So they're the only flying animal, or I'm sorry, only flying mammal. And I get a lot of questions like, what about flying squirrels? Well, flying squirrels can't actually fly. They glide. They're not able to do like from starting from no movement, pick up and fly on their own. Bats are the only ones that can do that. So that's a really an interesting characteristic. Another is that bats are nocturnal. So what does that mean? Maybe some of you know this already, but nocturnal essentially means that their cycles are opposite of ours. So whereas we are awake while the sun is up and when the sun is down, nocturnal animals do the opposite. So they are awake when the sun is down and they are asleep when the sun is up. And so this is an adaptation, a biological adaptation. This makes it easier for them to hunt for prey without a whole lot of predation. So there aren't a whole lot of animals that are awake at night. And so this makes it safer for bats to leave and go hunt prey. And so basically when we're going to sleep, they're having breakfast. So that's sort of this like really very simplistic way to explain what nocturnal animals are. They aren't the only ones. Like I said, owls are nocturnal, ravens are nocturnal. But bats fall into that category as well. And so if you've ever seen a bat, chances are you were seeing it as the sun was setting and it was coming out of maybe a barn or an attic and it was flying. It was leaving to go feed at dusk because like I said, that's when they're going to have their breakfast. So bats can echolocate. What does that mean? Maybe you've heard this, maybe you haven't. Echolocation is this ability for bats to use sound waves to figure out where objects are. So whether that's a tree that they're trying to avoid or whether it's an animal that they're trying to hunt. And so the primary food source for many North American bats are insects. So they're insectivorous bats. So they specifically prey on flying insects, mosquitoes, moths, things like that. And so what they do is they emit these sound waves, and then those sound waves hit an object and then turn around and reverberate back to the bat. And how quickly those sound rates or those sound waves come back lets them know how distant or how close an object is. And so this is just a small animation sort of depicting what echolocation is. And so bats aren't blind, they can see. This is just an additional adaptation they have that makes it possible for them to hunt skillfully at night. So bats hibernate. Hibernation is this process where bats and other animals, bats aren't the only ones that hibernate, bears hibernate, for instance. So hibernation is this process where several months out of the year, specifically when it's cold outside, animals will go into a process called torpor, where torpor just means they slow down all of these biological processes. So their heart rate slows down, their respiratory system slows down, their immune system is slowed. And so that saves energy. So they eat when it's warm and during the spring and the summer and early fall. And then when it starts to get cold outside and they're nice and fat, hopefully, they go and they hibernate and they shut down all of these processes so that they essentially go to sleep for the cold months. And then when it starts to warm back up, they wake back up again, they come out of torpor, and they leave their caves or their mines, wherever they're hibernating, and then they go and refeed and they start the process of having pups and starting that sort of cycle all over again. So this is a really unique characteristic that they have, and one of the reasons that they're susceptible to the disease that we're going to talk about today. And last but not least, bats are really important. They're very ecologically important. And so bats pollinate. So this process where plants have pollen dispersed so that they germinate and grow new plants is helped by flying animals. We hear about birds pollinating a lot, but we don't hear as much about bats. So bats are incredibly important pollinators. There was a study that was done several years ago where they were able to use these nets and use a bird only area and then a bat area where they looked at how much pollination rates happened. And for some plant species, bats were better pollinators, which meant they were more responsible for pollination than even the birds were. And so they're incredibly ecologically important because we have to have our plants and our crops, our agriculture, we have to have it pollinated in order to have food. So they're incredibly important. That's only one of the things that they do. What are some of the other things they do? Well, we talked about echolocation and you saw it in the diagram, but they eat mosquitoes and other pests. So they eat insects. And that's incredibly important because one, they're annoying. Let's just be honest, bugs are annoying. When you're outside, maybe in the summer, and you're trying to enjoy a hike and you just get bit all over the place. Well, bats are one of the animals that help control the number of mosquitoes we have. And so that's a reason they're important. And then this pollination thing that I just talked about. But lastly is they help spread seeds. So when they go to these plants and they eat seeds, this might be a little gross, but they poop those seeds in other parts. And so they help spread the seeds. And if you look at this image that just popped up, that's a bat covered in pollen. And he might need a bath. That's a bit excessive, but so it's just an example of, they go to these plants, they get covered in pollen, and then they fly to another plant and they drop that pollen off and they allow pollination and then germination of these plants to happen. So more plants grow. So they're incredibly important. We would certainly notice them if bats were gone. All right, so that's a perfect segue for our next sort of section, which is that bats are in trouble. Oh, I'm getting a...
I'm just going to remind you to check the chat.
Check the chat. Oh, here we go. Okay, let's see. What are the main predators for, okay, it was Molly. What are the main predators for bats? Okay, so with the exception of disease, which is what we're about to talk about, bigger mammals do eat bats. And so things that catch them that also fly do eat them. But so essentially bigger animals that are able to catch bats. I don't know that there's a specific type of animal that's a specific predator for bats, but basically any larger animals. I've even seen some documentaries where snakes will sometimes eat bats. So there are a wide array of types of animals that use bats as a form of as a nutrient source. Do they have a special organ to use echolocation? Well, you're about to find out that you're about to trap me here because I was a molecular biologist studying bats. And so my peripheral knowledge of their echolocation abilities, it doesn't expand very far. They might very well have one. It's not coming to me off the top of my head, but I'm sure that that's something that you can look up. Are there any particular plants you know of that are only pollinated by bats? So there are the plants that are responsible for, so bat pollinators are pretty generalists. There are some plants, like tequila plants, that are sort of only pollinated by bats because of the places that they grow. But as far as like the United States is concerned, they're generalists in terms of what they pollinate, which means just at large. Ben asks, when I was growing up in Vermont, I would see anywhere from 8 to 10 bats a night. Then the white nose syndrome made it so we would hardly see any at all, maybe the occasional 1 or 2. Now they seem to be making a little resurgence. Is white nose, or is WNS, which is white nose syndrome, still a big issue, or is that something that is no longer prevalent in the bat population? Thank you for asking, Ben. That is an excellent question, and it's exactly what we're about to talk about. So why don't we circle back to that question after I've talked about white nose syndrome? You buried my lead, dude. Just kidding. Thank you for asking that question. So here we go, white nose syndrome. Thank you, Ben, for the introduction. All right, so bats are in trouble. Why? As Ben has already pointed out, there's a disease called white nose syndrome, which is what we're going to talk about. So if you look at this picture of this bat on the nose, you see this like fuzzy white substance. And so that is a microbe that's growing across the surface of these bats. And it also, as it grows, it can lead to degradation of skin. So if you look at the wings of these bats, you see these holes form. And so what's causing it? It's this thing that Ben has already pointed out, white nose syndrome, which we abbreviate WNS. So white nose syndrome, what causes it? So there are several kingdoms of life. We're sorted by, and there's animals and plants and fungus are all sorted into these different groups. And then we have different categories of microbes as well. The thing that causes white nose syndrome is a fungus. So it's grouped into this category. So unfortunately, as far as the bats are concerned, there is a fungus among us. Sorry, my husband hated that joke, but it's perfect. All right, so there's a fungus that's causing white nose syndrome. And when you hear of the word fungus, this is what you think. You think mushrooms, right? They look like this, or maybe even possibly like this. Not all fungus look like that. Some fungus don't grow these really elaborate sort of mushrooms. But just to give you sort of an example, they're all grouped into this same category. Well, the fungus that causes white nose syndrome is this, which is gnarly looking, gross. And then the scientific name is Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which is certainly a mouthful. And so instead of Pseudogymnoascus destructans, in the bat community, we refer to it just as PD. So the first letters of each of the names, PD, that's how we talk about it, just so that we don't have to say that obnoxious word every time we write about it or we speak about it. So PD is what's causing white nose syndrome. And I see a couple of things popping up. So let me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Where is? Oh, Molly's loving my jokes. Thank you, Molly. I appreciate it. Keep the positive encouragement coming. All right, so Pseudogymnoascus destructans, or PD. So where was it first found? So if you look at, now I've lost control. Here it is. Okay, so if you look at this graph where you see the red circle at the top, that's where PD was first found. So it was found in upstate New York in 2006. So if we have some kids watching, maybe it was here before you were even born. But in 2006, we found the first signs of this fungus, and it's not from North America. It's considered an invasive species. So it was brought over probably on someone's physical body. Cavers like to go and go spelunking deep down in sort of these dark caves. And what happens sometimes is the spores, the fungal spores that they pick up, if they don't wash them off and they go cave somewhere else, they can drop those spores off. And so it's possible that that's what happened. We don't really know how it ended up there, but that's a theory that circulates in the white nose community. So these fungal spores somehow ended up in this cave in upstate New York, and then they grew and they spread, and the first biologist sort of went to do this cave survey, or the first biologist that found white nose went to this cave in upstate New York and just saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dead bats, unfortunately. And then every year since then, indicated in this graphic with the colors, every sort of iteration every iteration of this disease spread we've seen has been going year by year by year ever since then, unfortunately, to the point that now it's made an entire jump across to the West Coast. It's sort of had a transcontinental sort of spread, which is unfortunate because it's been implicated in the death of a lot of bats, which is what we're going to talk about. And so maybe we have some people outside of the Asheville area that are watching. So I don't know, maybe you live in a part of the country that might or might not be have been found white nose positive yet, but it is continuing to spread across the United States and parts of Canada. All right, and because of its spread, some bat species are in danger of going extinct, unfortunately. And so there are many of them that have been found positive for white nose syndrome, and we'll talk about that when we get to sort of my more PhD specific work. But these two images show two of the species that currently some of the most impacted by the disease. So the one on the left side of your screen, that's the little brown bat. And the little brown bat was one of the most common in the eastern portion of the United States before the disease spread. And then the one on the right is the northern long-eared bat, or Myotis septentrionalis. And this one, we're seeing population declines upwards of 99%, which is incredibly unfortunate. They look very similar. Honestly, when we're out in the field, the best way to distinguish between the two of them is by measuring the length of their ears. That's not the only way. There are some other characteristics, but they look very similar and they're very similar size. And so what does going extinct mean? So there are many causes of extinction. Disease, which you'll see in the on the right side, is only one of them. Climate change is causing extinction. I particularly like the dinosaur asteroid depiction on this graph. That's a theory that dinosaurs went extinct due to an asteroid that hit the Earth. Invasive species, lack of food, lack of genetic diversity, pollution. So there are many things that can cause extinction. But what happens when something goes extinct is that we don't have any members of that animal group left anymore. And so sort of it starts with they're threatened, which means they're in trouble. And then we get to them being endangered, which means we have a critically few of them left. And then if those all die, they end up extinct, which is sad. And bats are not the only animals currently that are threatened, or they're endangered and possibly going to go extinct. They're one of many. So conservation and thinking about these animals and how to help them survive long term is incredibly important. So that's what extinction means. So bats like Stella Luna need your help. So what can you do? I get this question a lot when you're a bat biologist, which, as we've learned by my inability to answer that echolocation question, I'm really a molecular biologist who pretends to be a bat biologist. But anyway, what can you do? I get this question a lot. So the first thing is be a bat ambassador. I wasn't one, and that's a shame. Before I became a PhD student, I wanted to study disease, which is how I ended up in this field, wildlife disease specifically. But I actually didn't know how crucial bats were to our ecosystem health until I was a graduate student. And so being a bat ambassador, they get a bad rap. A lot of people talk about how they carry diseases and how they are kind of scary. And the truth is that they're not really either of those things. Bats really only come out at night because they're nocturnal, not because they're associated with Halloween all the time necessarily. And they actually probably prevent more disease than they cause. We hear about rabies a lot. Very few bats, especially bats in North America, carry rabies. And you have to be bitten by a bat in order for that to happen, which is not going to happen as long as we don't mess with them, and they usually don't mess with us. And so be a bat ambassador, read a little bit more about them. You can reach out to me and ask questions. Hopefully I'll be able to answer them because they're actually really cool and they're really important. Reduce pesticides. So I don't know if you've ever driven by a big field that's a crop, or maybe you have a small garden and you see people outside kind of putting this pesticide or spraying this pesticide all over them. There are uses that we've been using pesticides for a really long time to kill off insects that ruin crops. And so there's an argument out there that they are necessary in order to yield crops. But if you have a small garden, not using pesticides helps bats because it keeps the insect number high enough that they have a lot of food sources. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the fatter and the bigger the bat is before it goes into hibernation, the more likely it is to survive white nose syndrome. So if we can reduce those pesticides and increase the number of insects and the number of options, their buffet, if you will, then chances are they're going to have a better likelihood of surviving white nose syndrome if they get infected. So another way you can have is put up a bat house. So bat houses, just depicted in this picture, are these small wooden boxes that give bats a place to roost that aren't going back in sort of these caves. And so if you put a bat house next to a water source, so if you have a pond or a lake or maybe a swampy area where there are a lot of bugs or insects, and you give a bat a place to live, that can increase their chances of survival, especially if it's next to a really great food source. And so I'm going to send Abigail plans for how to build a simple bat house that hopefully maybe she can put on the Facebook page or something. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn here. I'm getting a nod, so hopefully that's okay. But there are some plans that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has released that are real simple instructions, and you don't need a lot of wood to build a bat house. You might have enough scrap at your house to do it now. You just need some wood and some nails and a hammer, and you can, with your parents' permission, put up a bat house. So they're incredibly helpful, and the closer you have it to a water source, the better. And last but not least, be a citizen scientist. So you don't actually have to have a degree in biology to be able to help bats. If you want to get a degree in biology, I encourage you to go for it. But until then, you can help bats as a scientist before you ever even get that degree. So there are bat counts that we do in order to know how many bats we have left and whether or not their numbers are increasing or decreasing. One of the things we do is we do these bat counts. And so late at night, or not late at night, but late in the afternoon, right before the sun goes down completely, we see bats start to emerge out of these attics or these barns, depending upon where they are during the summer. And we literally count them. And so to the best of our ability, I mean, there are some flaws because we don't know, maybe we're counting the same one twice. But for the most part, it gives us a good sense of how many bats are living in that area. And so a lot of local conservation groups, sometimes the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in your area, they host these bat blitzes where they have people just like you come out and help count these bats, just to get an idea of how many are in the area. And so I know things are a little weird right now because of the pandemic, but when things get back to normal, hopefully sooner rather than later, and these sort of things start happening again, see if you can volunteer if you're interested to go and do these bat counts. They're really neat. And I enjoyed doing them when I was doing research as a PhD student. And to that note, I'm going to shift and talk a little bit more about my PhD work. But before I do that, I'm going to see if there are any questions. Adam wrote, Molly is my hype man. That's absolutely true. She always has been. Good looking out, Molly. How does white nose syndrome kill? Okay, so that's a good question. And I didn't put it in there initially because I wasn't sure how much detail I needed to go into, but I'll answer that question real quick. So white nose syndrome, a lot of people think that the growth of the fungus itself is what directly causes the death of the bat. But in reality, what happens is as this bat, we talked about torpor. I mentioned torpor at the beginning, where bats go into hibernation and they shut down all of these biological processes to conserve energy. Because during the winter, there aren't a whole lot of bugs out for these bats to eat. So they want to be able to hold on to as many of those energy reserves as they can. Well, what happens is as this fungus, as PD grows across the skin of these bats, it siphons off water and nutrients. So it literally eats away at its fat reserves and it disturbs it. So it literally wakes it up out of torpor. And every time a bat is aroused out of torpor, it's energetically expensive. It costs about 13%, give or take, of a bat's energy reserves to wake up and restart all of these biological processes. So if a bat is woken up multiple times during the winter, it's going to burn through those fat reserves and starve by the end of hibernation. So when bats die of white nose syndrome, they're not dying necessarily from the primary infection of the fungus. They're dying because they're starving or they're dehydrated. And so if you're ever out, if you live in an area where there's a cave and you know bats are hibernating and you see them flying around in the middle of winter, chances are it's been woken up by white nose syndrome and it's hungry and it's outside looking for insects to replenish those fat reserves before it goes back into hibernation. And like I said, there aren't that many that are out and about. There aren't that many insects that are out and about in the winter. So usually they're not able to find those food sources, unfortunately. So that's what leads to high rates of mortality and death in these bats. So that's how white nose kills bats. Okay, and the next question was, I know that bats sometimes have rabies. Does susceptibility to disease like rabies increase with white nose syndrome? There have been no published correlations between those two diseases. So that's a good question because I get a lot of specific questions about rabies as it relates to bats. I've never gotten that one specifically, but to my knowledge, there's no published or known correlation. If someone's doing that research, I'm not aware of it, but to my knowledge, no. Will you be talking about the molecular mechanisms of how the wing tissue becomes necrotic? Well, the molecular mechanisms are still undergoing. A lot of people are researching that, but essentially the holes themselves are formed by fungal degradation of the proteins. And so it's literally eating away at the skin. And so the fungus is psychrophilic, which means it thrives in cold environments, and it loves sort of fatty, protein-rich nutrient sources. And so unfortunately, bats are this perfect reservoir because they're in cold climates and they're fatty when they're coming out of hibernation, or when they're going into hibernation, coming out of sort of their swarming feeding season. And so those holes form as a result of literal fungal degradation, breaking that down so that they can use it as a protein or nutrient source. So that's what causes the holes. We don't see the severity of holes until late stage infection. So the fungus has been there a long time. And so some bats have really bad tissue degradation, and then some don't have that much. And so we're seeing some variability and susceptibility to white nose. And so I'm actually going to talk about some of that with my PhD work, not specific to the amount of tissue degradation we're seeing, but the susceptibility differences that cause some of those differences. All right, and so Ben asks, I've been hearing more and more concerned scientists talk about the decline of insect populations, which could be a great detriment to our ecosystem. Has this had any measurable effect on bats? Is it something that has even been studied or observed? That's a great question. And so as pesticides have continued to be used, we are seeing decreases in sort of insect populations. I don't know the extent to which that wasn't necessarily an integral part of my PhD work, but there have been some discussions of, as insect populations decline, what's that going to mean for food sources for bats? And so if that's an active area of research, I'm not aware of it. That would be like a really hard ecology focused question. And my stuff was far more molecular, but that's an excellent question. And, just without even knowing necessarily what the data says, I mean, obviously that's important, but my guess would be that as, insect populations, especially insects that are pretty commonly consumed by bats, as those populations decline, it would more than likely affect bat populations because, like I said, the more nutrient buildup, the more fat reserves they have before they go into hibernation, the more likely they are to survive white nose. And so it would probably be this it would exacerbate an already terrible issue because if they're skinnier, because there's not as much food available before they go into hibernation, they're more likely to die of white nose syndrome. So it's a great question, Ben. Thank you for sending it in. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my PhD work. And I'm going to keep this kind of vague, but I'm happy to answer questions. I'm only going to be talking about one of my dissertations. So I mentioned a few bats at the beginning that are susceptible to white nose syndrome, but there are actually 13 North American bat species that have the diagnostic symptoms of the disease. This was pulled from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service site, so they keep this incredibly up to date. So the 13 are obviously listed there. The ones that are asterisk marked in blue are the ones that have to date been listed as either federally threatened or federally endangered. And so you see only 3 there. And so a question might be, well, that's not that many, but getting something listed for the Fish and Wildlife Service as threatened or endangered is expensive and it takes a long time. And so just because we only have 3 that are currently asterisk marked or listed doesn't necessarily mean that they're the only ones that are undergoing severe population decline. So that's just a plug because I don't want people thinking that this isn't a huge problem, because it definitely is. Those are just the only 3 so far that have made it up the entire chain of command to be federally listed. So obviously the ones that are listed as endangered are the gray bat and the Indiana bat, and then threatened is the northern long-eared bat. So these 13 species have all been confirmed with diagnostic symptoms of white nose. However, they're not all dying at the same rates. For instance, the big brown bat at the top, big brown bats, we do see traces of white nose syndrome, we do see symptoms, and sometimes we see associated bat death. But overall, their populations are still pretty healthy. And when we are seeing population declines, they're rebounding relatively quickly. And so, yes, there are concern insofar as we are seeing symptoms of white nose, but they're likely not going to be threatened or endangered by this disease because we're just not seeing huge amounts of death. That cannot be said for little brown bats or northern long-eared bats. So we're seeing differences in susceptibility, as the point I'm making. The ones that are circled in red are the ones that are specific to the research that I did for my first chapter. So these were the species that I looked at for one of my dissertation chapters, the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and then the tricolored bat. So I circle those just so as a frame of reference for what I'm about to talk about. So when you have an entire population, which is what this represents, so let's say this is all one species, and this is one population of one species, and they eat all summer, get as fat as possible, and then they go into a cave to hibernate throughout the winter, and unfortunately they all get infected with white nose syndrome. So the little white dots on their nose represent they're all impacted by white nose syndrome, and at the end of that period of hibernation, some live, some die. So let's say the ones with the green arrows are the ones that lived, and then the ones with the red check marks, or the X's, I'm sorry, are the ones that died. My question going into some of my PhD work are, why are we seeing these differences? Why seemingly are the same species within the same sort of habitat or population, why are we seeing differences in the survival of some and the death of others? So what's causing that? So basically, in a nutshell, processes are playing a role in a species susceptibility to white nose syndrome. And so one of the theories that was sort of circulating in the community, and then I had, specific questions about that went into my PhD work, is the role of the microbiome. So what is a microbiome? A microbiome is a collection of microbes. So that's tiny microscopic life, bacteria, fungus, bacteriophages, viruses, basically anything that viruses touch and go, so maybe scratch that one. But anyway, bacteria, fungal, so microscopic life that are in a community make up a microbiome. So the surfaces of anything, so your skin, you have a gut microbiome, they're everywhere. And so we found that some of these microbiome, or some of the members of these microbiomes, are great defenders, or they're great protectors to invasive pathogens. So something comes in, and these ones with the lightsabers are maybe great defenders, and then this guy in the bottom with the fork is practically useless, and then this other guy does nothing. So why are we seeing these differences? And so are members of a microbiome playing a role that could potentially explain why some are dying of white nose and then others aren't? Because as I've discussed, this fungus grows on the skin of these bats. So maybe it's implicated in their disease susceptibility. So essentially what I did was I looked at the microbiomes of these bats. So this is a caricature or a mock-up of what I did essentially. So on these bat wings, we swabbed and swabbed. The same bat was considered one individual population. And I looked at these populations to see if there were differences that could be correlated to disease susceptibility. So what did I find? Or what did I do? I'm sorry. So I used those three species that I mentioned before. So the little brown bat, the big brown bat, and then the tricolored bat. And the ones that are highlighted in red, or framed in red, are the ones who are most severely impacted by the disease. And then the one that's framed in yellow, the big brown bat, like I said earlier, we're seeing diagnostic symptoms, but we're not as worried about them. So maybe their microbiomes are such that they're able to fight off the fungus better than the little brown bat or the tricolored bat. So this was my question going into this. And I could spend a really long time explaining to you the kind of sequencing I did and all of that, but I'll spare you those details because they are boring, and instead go to my results. So what I found was that brown bats, or Myotis lucifagus, was the bat whose bacterial microbiome was the most dramatically altered by the presence of the fungus. So basically what I found was, as the amount of fungus increased on an individual bat, the amount of bacterial diversity in its microbiome decreased. And so essentially what this means, or what it could potentially mean, is that this fungus reduces the bacterial community diversity, which might be implicated in infection severity. But that doesn't necessarily mean, this is sort of a rough first pass. More research would need to be done in order to say this with 100% certainty. But this is a working hypothesis we have as to why we're seeing this in just this specific bat. We didn't see any bacterial differences in the big brown bat, and we didn't see any bacterial differences in the tricolored bat either, even though the tricolored bat is one of the bats who is also incredibly susceptible to the disease. And so it might not be universally true for all of these species that the bacterial microbiome plays a role in infection severity, but it's possible that for little brown bats, this could somehow be related. That certainly wasn't all of my PhD work. I'm just gonna, as a selfless plug here, say that a lot more goes into a dissertation than that. These are some of the other figures that made up the chapters, the collective chapters that were my entire dissertation. And I would be more than happy to talk about that, but I decided to not berate you with graphs, but instead spend the last section of time answering questions about bats themselves, or my job, how I got into this work, and then, or maybe how I got into being a scientist in general. And so I already see some notifications in the chat. So let me look at those quickly. And then if you have any questions about, like I said, bats in general, my PhD work, or what I did as a graduate student and or currently what I do in my job, fire away. So let's see. Okay, can you quickly summarize the listing process? Okay, so what that means is federal listing according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So when you say an animal is listed according to the Fish and Wildlife Service, it means that it's listed as either threatened, endangered, or extinct, unfortunately, and we're trying to avoid that. Well, we're trying to avoid them all, but especially that one. So in order for something to be listed, biologists just like me, and Dr. Molly is on the call, Dr. Adam, Dr. Jossie, they're all on the call too. They all work in sort of the same field. And questions that we have often relate to the amount of animals or the number of animals of a species that are dying off. So obviously for me, it's bats. For other animals or for other species, this is also a concern. So essentially, we notice that something's causing major amounts of declines. Biologists, federal agencies go out and they see, oh, this is a problem. And then in order to get something listed, a petition is made to the Department of the Interior, specifically the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where you make a case for why this animal, this particular species, needs to be reviewed. And it's called a species status assessment. So you take into account all of the things you know to be true or biologically true about these animals or about this species in general. This takes into account their habitat, what populations were like before the threat, whether it was climate change that's causing it, disease that's causing it, maybe habitat destruction. So you take into account all the things you know to be biologically true about this species, and you put together what's called an SSA, or a species status assessment, and you submit it to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and other scientists look at it, and it goes under review to see if it takes priority over other species in terms of a biodiversity threat. So is it on the verge of extinction? And the more on the verge of extinction it is, or the more threatened it is, the higher up in priority it becomes. And so particular numbers, there's not a magic number for how many species or how many individuals of that species have to be left in order to have something listed, because it's highly dependent on what the system was like or what the species was like before the threat. But that's the general process. Let's see. Are you aware of any genetic resistance studies? Yes. So we are seeing patterns of genetic resistance, and a lot of that has to do. So genetic can mean multiple things. It can mean genetic at the individual bat's gene level. And so we're seeing patterns of resistance. One of my other chapters on the northern long-eared bat looked at just this. So we looked at the sort of the simplistic way to say it, but we looked at the genes that are under selection in bats that are seemingly surviving the disease, to see if there were any that are possibly correlated to possible reasons that these bats are surviving. And so we saw a lot of genes that are implicated in fat retention. So that makes sense, right? Because bats that are better able to hold on to their fat reserves or to store fat are the ones that are going to be a little chunkier before going into hibernation, and therefore maybe more likely to survive the disease. So I did that for northern long-eared bats, but there are people who are doing them for little brown bats. And there have been, now they're all correlations. And so that just means that they're possibly implicated in resistance, but that is an active field of research that many people are currently looking at. What are the current trends of white nose syndrome? Is it improving, getting worse? Okay, that's a great question. And so I guess it depends on what you're, so in terms of at certain population levels, we are seeing some maternity colonies of little brown bats increasing in number. So we saw, if the population was here, white nose hit, and then it, it decimated the number of individuals in that colony. And we are seeing that number rise a little bit. So that could be the result of some patterns of resistance we're seeing. It could also be maybe the microbiome is implicated, because for some of those, that's little brown bats. There are a lot of factors at play. So in that sense, at some sites, we are seeing some improvement. Now, getting worse, the disease is continuing to spread. And so there are some colonies in the more western portions of the United States that haven't been impacted by white nose yet, just because it hasn't gotten there yet. And so we know that when it does get there, we're probably going to see continued bat loss as the fungus continues to spread. And so I guess it depends on how you look at it. At some colony sites in the East where white nose has been around for a really long time, we are seeing colonies start to rebound. But in other parts where they haven't been exposed to white nose yet, we're gonna see population declines of those animals before we see them come back up again, if they do at all. And so that's our hope. So that's a good question. So I've always been curious, you're so focused on policy, but you got a PhD in genomics. Why did you go the bio route? Molly already knows the answer to this question, but I will talk about it because I think it's interesting, and I hope you do too. So I studied biology as an undergraduate. So I'm originally from the state of Alabama. I went to the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and I studied biology, and I loved it. I didn't study bats, actually. I studied marine sponges, which is a whole different thing. But I studied sponges, and I loved it. And I knew I wanted to go on to study biology once I was ready to go back to graduate school. But I noticed that what we were doing was we were sort of creating all this genetic data, or not just genetic data, just data in general. And the federal government was paying for us to sort of do this work. And then we were just sort of publishing academic papers, and it really wasn't being, I don't want to say it wasn't being used, but I wanted the impact of science dollars to go further. And so I started looking at jobs for people that do that. And what I kept seeing over and over again was policy, 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 policy. And the people that were in these agencies, or who were working for these, working in these jobs, had higher level degrees in science. And so I decided to get my PhD, but specifically so I could apply my PhD to work in the public policy sector to help make federal science dollars go further, because a lot of science is funded by the federal government, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, the Department of Defense. All of these sort of federal agencies exist, not solely to fund us, but that's part of what they do. They fund scientists. And so now more than ever, I think that we see how important that is, especially in light of the spread of this virus that's causing sort of everything to sort of change overnight. And so science funding is important, but I wanted to make sure, I wanted to work in a field that allowed me to make sure that we got the most bang for our buck, essentially, out of what we're paying for science. And so that's why I ended up in public policy, and that's why I majored in science, and I got a graduate degree in science to get there. It's a good question. All right. Okay, that is not a, okay, Ben asked, what's your favorite fact or aspect of bats that no one asks you about? That's a great question. Ben, I think we've just become best friends. Okay, let me think. Okay, this isn't my favorite, well, can I say my favorite story about bats? Because that's what I really want to talk about. Okay. Well, most people are scared of bats because this implication that they carry diseases and, you know, rabies, rabies, rabies. We hear that all the time. The truth is that in all of my time as a 5-year PhD student doing bat field work, I would not have gotten bitten had it not been for my own irresponsibility. So had I been always wearing the correct PPE, because I was going into their habitat, they weren't coming into mine, I would have been fine. But I had a lack or an error in judgment one time, and I reached into the bottom of our trap without gloves on. My husband's pointing at me, this happened 3 times, and he's right, this did happen 3 times. I was only gonna tell them the once, thank you, Randy, but it did happen 3 times. And it was all my fault because I should have been wearing proper protective equipment, because when you are, bats are not a threat. But I reached down in this bag with a bare hand and I got bit, which makes sense because we were trapping them. They were scared. We were in their habitat, trapping them at night. But I got bitten by a bat in the middle of nowhere in Brattleboro, Vermont. And so I had to get rushed to a hospital the next day because I likely wasn't going to be infected with rabies because, again, the chances are very low. But the safe thing to do when you've gotten bit by a bat is to go regardless. So I went, and the doctor came into the room, and I told him that I was a bat biologist. And he looked at me like I was potentially the dumbest person on the planet for actively and purposefully being out in the field studying bats. But I used it as an opportunity to talk to him about why bats are important. And so by the time it was all said and done, he said that he thought that was interesting and he didn't know all of that. And about 3 months later, I got an email from him because I gave him my email in case he had questions. And he told me that he went to do a bat bio blitz and he went to count bats. And so even though I got bitten and I had to be hospitalized and get terrible shots, I was able to make a bat ambassador out of him. And he was so skeptical to begin with. So that's one of my favorite things that happened while I was researching bats. But again, had I been wearing the proper PPE that they told me to wear 1,000,000 times and I ignored, which is not recommended, that wouldn't have happened. So anyways, that's my favorite story, mostly because that was a huge lack in judgment, and don't follow my lead, kids. Okay, last question. How does your PhD work affect policy for bats and listing status for the species you worked with? So in my actual job, I unfortunately don't get to do a whole lot of work with bats anymore. But as a side note, I stay actively involved in bat conservation, that I work in a volunteer capacity to help get other species listed. And so I think when I was talking about listing for these species, I mentioned this thing called a species status assessment. Well, one of the things that I was able to merge my background in science with my interest in public policy and write the species status assessment for the tricolored bat, which is a Perimyotis subflavus is its scientific name. And so now it's going up the pipeline to possibly be listed because its population has declined to such a degree that it should be listed according to sort of in comparison to other bats that are on the endangered species list. And so while my job, I don't do bat work anymore, as a citizen who is concerned with bats and who happens to know a lot about sort of the endangered listing process, I use my free time to do that because it's so important. Okay, Steve, your passion shows. Oh, thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. I'm very concerned that people, especially weekend warrior spelunkers, fair enough, might target bats because of their connection to SARS-CoV-2. Okay, so the COVID-19. Have you or any of your bat connections seen this in your study areas? Obviously, part of the answer lies in education, getting the facts out to kids and even adults. Good question, Steve. Thank you for sending it. So the pandemic started it started to take off sort of the early parts of this year. And I defended my PhD in April. So I actually haven't been around a whole lot of people who are going out in the field who are actively doing bat work right now. And a lot of it is suspended because of the concerns associated with COVID-19, meaning that a lot of bat work has been put on hold because of that. And so there are some concerns. I do know that there is a very impassioned and very informed group of bat enthusiasts, both scientists and non-scientists, just citizens, who fortunately are great defenders and ambassadors of bats and the ecological services that they provide. And so my hope is that there won't be this sort of backlash against bats, because the truth is that while I am not an expert on this particular virus, it wasn't in any way part of my PhD work, I do know that many times when events like this happen, sort of spillover events from animals to humans, it's often because of things that we've done. We've destroyed their habitats, or we've hunted them, or something has happened. There a crossover event has happened. And so to run to their defense, I hope that that message, even though it's not a priority right now in light of all the other things going on, I hope that that message gets across, because bats do far more good than they cause harm. And so we are very dependent on them. And I hope that that message, including everyone that's listening to this, either on Zoom or on Facebook, if you were able to tune in or watch it later, I hope that you will run to their defense as well, because without them, we would suffer both agriculturally and from a pest perspective. And so, yes, there's some circulating, I don't call them rumors necessarily, because again, this is not my field of work, but there are some correlations that are being discussed between bats and our current pandemic. But I will run to their defense and say that, again, usually when that happens, it is because there has been some invasives or habitat destruction, or there's some issue on our end that's causing these spillover events to happen. And if we learn to be a bit more think more collectively with who we share the planet with, including members of other species, other animal species, some of this could be avoided. And so, but that's a great question. And part of the answer lies in education. You're absolutely right. And advocacy on our end for people who are bat enthusiasts, or just understand how valuable they are to our biodiversity and our ecosystem, to sort of step up and say something to defend them when people make that correlation in the future, which I hope that they don't, but it's a possibility. Thank you, Steve. That's a great question.
Well, Megan, as an educator, we are so thankful that awesome scientists like you take the time to support these STEM initiatives, to get the word out about what you're studying and why it's so important, and make that really accessible to everyone. So we really appreciate your time. Please send me those resources, and everybody who's still watching the call, I will make sure to get those posted on our website, on our Facebook page, and then just across all of our social media sites. And if you have follow-up questions, definitely send them into myself at the museum, or send them into Megan, and we can get those answered for you. Thank you so much again, Megan, and thank you everyone for watching. We will be back next week with marine biology.
Bye.
Bye, have a good afternoon.
You too.